Good evening and welcome to another ZFA conversation. My name is Bren Carlil and I'm the Public Affairs Director at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. Tonight is going to be a great conversation, but before I introduce our speakers, I do hope you'll permit me to engage in a little bit of housekeeping. First, mark April 18 in your calendars, as we'll be speaking with key Zionist thinkers Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky. Both of these, you might remember, appeared separately on the ZFA's Lockdown Learning series last year. We'll be speaking with Gil and Natan about their co-authored book, Never Alone, and about Zionist identity in the past, present, and future. Go to zfa.com.au/conversations to register. Second, please feel free to ask questions of our guests this evening using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will ask the questions of our guests towards the end of the conversation. If you particularly like a question that someone else has posted, click on the thumbs up pictogram. A question with the most thumbs up tends to rise to the top of the list. Third and finally, I'm going to make a poll pop up on your screen. There it is. As you can see, the poll asks your opinion as to the likely outcome of this election. I'll make another poll with an identical question pop up towards the end of our conversation. I think it will be fascinating to see where we stand now and whether or not tonight's conversation will shift our opinion. I'll share the results of the poll during the conversation. So it's finally time to introduce our guests. To help us interpret the political and electoral mess in which Israel finds itself, we have Mark Sofer and Lahav Harkov. Lahav is a senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent at the Jerusalem Post, where she analyzes and reports on Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's Office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. Lahav grew up in the United States and moved to Israel at age 17. She has a degree in political science and communications from Bar-Ilan University. Mark will be well known to many of you, and not just because he was one of our first lockdown learning guests last year. Mark was, until his retirement in August last year, a career diplomat with Israel's foreign ministry. His last posting was, of course, as ambassador to Australia. Before that, he was ambassador to India and Ireland and had postings in Peru, Norway, and the United States. Mark has a Bachelor in Economics and International Relations from the London School of Economics and a Master's in Political Science from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Tonight, Lahav and Mark will be speaking with ZFA President Jeremy Leibler. And so with no further ado, I will hand you over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Bren. And Mark and Lahav, thank you both for joining us. Lahav, welcome to Australia, albeit virtually. And Mark, it is wonderful to see you again. We miss you. So we're delighted to bring a taste of you back to the Australian Jewish community. Let's perhaps start with the fact that Israel's just had its fourth election in 2 years, and it doesn't look like either camp can form a government with any ease at the moment, although Bennett and Saar are yet to sort of show their hand. Lahav, if I can start with you, and we'll get to how we think things are going to play out a little bit later on, but can you just give us your sense, Lahav, of how we got to this point? How did we get to the fact that we're having our fourth election in Australia? We're used to our share of elections and political instability, but I think, we're all scratching our heads here in the diaspora trying to reconcile the startup nation with this sort of dysfunction. So tell us where it all comes from.
So if you look at the polling numbers consistently in all four elections in the last 2 years, the right wing has a clear majority. It's very clear that most Israelis support parties that promote right-wing policies. The problem is that these elections have not been about policies. They've been about personalities. And more specifically, they've been about yes, Bibi, no Bibi. So while you have a majority supporting the ideology that Netanyahu stands for, you don't have a majority supporting Netanyahu's party or parties that have said that they will sit in a coalition with Netanyahu. And, you know, no matter how many times we go to the polls, or at least 4 times that we've gone to the polls, we've not really been able to crack that. And honestly, if we go to a 5th election, I don't know if it'll change. I think Netanyahu seems to do a little bit worse every time, but more or less, you know, he just is not able to form a coalition. And so either the parties need to move on from this sort of yes/no question and work in a more sort of normal political way where they sort of negotiate on the political issues of the day, or Netanyahu needs to step aside. That being said, Netanyahu is the head of Likud, which is one of the only parties that actually has a primary system, and he was fairly elected in a landslide to head his party. So I don't really see that happening, especially because, you know, if he was going to step aside, he would have done it already. We're on the 4th election. So we are at this impasse. And I think, you know, if we're going to get philosophical about it, I think it's because of the sort of the takeover of personality and sort of personal ego over the actual political issues and the needs of the Israeli voters.
And of course, I mean, that's not really unique today to Israel. We're seeing that sort of all around the world with the rise of populist governments. But is something
I think what's
different?
Unique though, I think what's unique though is Israel for decades now has not had a culture where people resign if they do something wrong or if they're accused of doing something wrong. Which I don't know how it is in Australia, but in many Western countries, there is a culture that if you have an accusation to resign, and I'm not making a judgment as to whether Netanyahu should resign or not, but having a prime minister under indictment on several political charges, which in my opinion, some are not such serious charges, but some are more serious, it's not a normal situation. And so it combines sort of international political trends of populism and in general personal politics, even before this rise of populism in the last decade or so. It's for several decades now, it's the rise of personal before party has been going on. But we have this sort of added element here where politicians stay in office despite being on trial.
We are dealing with not dissimilar issues here in the Australian political context. Mark, as a former diplomat, even though we were going to advertise this session as Mark Sofer Unplugged, I won't ask you who you voted for, but I will ask you if you were the kingmaker in this election. If you were Bennett or Saar, or according to some, Ram, if you could effectively decide who would form government, what would be the key sort of issues, priorities, factors that would play into your decision as to which camp to support?
Well, each of us and every single one of us in Israel, first of all, I should say good evening to everybody in Australia, all my friends. I can't see any of you, but I'm sure most of you or many of you I actually know, and it's wonderful to be back with you all, at least virtually, and hopefully soon it'll be more than that. So good evening to everybody, and good day to everybody who's in Israel. But if I could just take a step back, I'll answer that question. I'm not one of those politicians who avoid questions, but I agree with almost everything that Lahav said, except for one point or two. To start with, I think that these elections that we just had were completely and utterly unnecessary. There was absolutely no point to have them. We had a government in power. Was it functional? No, it wasn't. Have we had dysfunctional governments in the past? Of course we have. Are we going to have a dysfunctional government in the future? Definitely, whatever comes up, it's going to be dysfunctional. There was no reason whatsoever to have them. And the only reason no one can come up with were actually, as Lahav said, were personal reasons. Somebody needed to stay in power because there was no practical reason otherwise, other than that, not to have a budget. I do tend to disagree with this yes Bibi, no Bibi approach to the whole political setup right now. I don't think it's only Bibi the person. I think it's everything around it, the attack on the judicial system, the attack on the police, or what is seen to be. It doesn't matter whether it is or it isn't, and I have my own political view on that. But the bottom line is the personal attack on the ex-chief of police, the personal attack on the attorney general, on the personal attack on the judges. All of this was seen as an attack on democracy. And so it's not actually anti-Bibi. It's not only the person. It's also the surrounding atmospherics that come with some of his yes men or women, actually. People like Miri Regev or Miki Zohar or others. I don't know if these names mean everything to everyone. And there was sort of an atmosphere out there of what we would say in Alehum, we'll just jump on them. And I think that was the yes, it's been reduced to yes Bibi, no Bibi, but it's actually more, I would say, yes Bibism and no Bibism rather than yes Bibi, no Bibi. Now, as far as what you can expect in the future, that's almost an impossible question to answer. I think to a large extent, and here I certainly agree with Lahav, Bibi has come out worse than every single one of the 4 elections that we've had. And there's no possibility, or there's no reason that if there is a 5th election, it'll be any better. I think the opposite is the case, and these particular elections weren't won by anybody, that's clear, but they were lost by some, and I think first and foremost Bibi himself, who really, as one commentator said recently here, he stood in front of an open goal and missed. He was acting prime minister. He had the Abrahamic Accords. He had the vaccination going on all over the place. And most important of all is that the Arab voters didn't vote, or they really reduced their voting, which should have given a major boost. And even under those circumstances, and as acting prime minister at the time, which gave him, of course, much more press and much more publicity, he still didn't manage to pull it off. And I think that really is something which is very important to look at. Trouble, of course, is that there's no really other camp. It doesn't really exist. It's a disparate group of left and right and the middle. There's, of course, egos. There always are egos. And in Australia as well, you have them. And I can say that now, but I'm out of the job. But we all remember the Turnbull Abbott. We all remember, well, everybody basically, egos in every democratic system. So I don't really know what will be the major issues, because I think right now it is a question of, can we pull, and this is perhaps the most important, who can pull in the the Ram party? That is really the key. It's quite amazing, really, that after an election, an Islamic party, an Islamist sort of party, is holding the reins. But that's what it is. And basically, to all intents and purposes, Bibi has replaced Gantz for Mansour Abbas. That's where we are right now. So somebody's going to have to, a lot of people are going to have to jump off their hobby horses and put aside the promises that they made beforehand. We won't sit with this one, we won't sit with the other one, we don't like this one, we don't like that one. Everyone's going to have to do something. But I think that's really the only question that's asking. I can think of about at least 7 different scenarios, all of which are equally plausible.
And so I want to come back to the Ram issue, because I think that development is absolutely fascinating for many reasons. But I just want to zero in on the question. So I was coming from a slightly different angle, Mark. I suppose more bigger picture. What I'm sort of seeing, with a lot of the discussion around these elections, it's sort of like, the pragmatism versus the principle. And we see that manifests itself a lot. And I suppose I'm asking less from the perspective of a political analyst or a political animal, but more, what do you think the average Israeli voter would want the kingmaker, whether it ends up being Bennett, Sa'ar, or Ram? Do you think Israelis want the kingmaker to make a pragmatic judgment as to, we've had 4 elections, we don't want a 5th, let's just find something to give some sense of stability? Or do you think Israelis are looking for more principled ideological decision-making and for a party to actually stick by their pre-election promises? And Lahav, I want to hear your view on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard answer, because it's a hard question to answer, because after the 3rd election, right, Benny Gantz took the plunge and said, I'm going to break my biggest election promise, which was not to sit in a coalition with Netanyahu. and we're going to form a unity government because we have to get out of this cycle of endless elections. And for that, he was rewarded by losing half of his seats in the Knesset. Now, of course, it was a totally dysfunctional government, but from the get-go, polling showed that it was not a popular move, that the people who had voted for him didn't want him to be in a government with Netanyahu. That being said, what do I think the majority wants in Israel? I mean, I think from the way people voted, it's very clear that there's a right-wing majority in Israel. And so I think if there was a right-wing government, most Israelis would be to some extent satisfied with it, maybe not fully satisfied, depending on who's at the helm. You know, so the sort of reasonable and maybe ideological kind of answer would be a government that would be Netanyahu, the Haredim, Bennett, the religious Zionist party, which is the extreme right wing, or maybe just parts of it, because that's a bloc made up of a few all extreme but at varying levels of extreme parties. And then the New Hope Party, led by Gideon Sa'ar, it's a breakaway party. Most of the people in the party came from Likud, all really, and their issue was, like Mark said, I agree with him that it's not just Bibi the person, it's Bibism. It's that you know, that Netanyahu has turned to this kind of populism and not just criticizing the institutions, the legal institutions of Israel, because Sa'ar himself is a critic of the Supreme Court and has all sorts of plans on how he thinks there should be judicial reforms in Israel. That's the whole right wing. But the sort of populist way in which they do it is the problem. So it's an issue of style that reveals a kind of substance, I would say. It's more style than substance, but the style says something, right? So anyway, so I think, you know, you go to the average Israeli, it's like 72 out of 120 Knesset seats, they would say they want a right-wing government. The problem is, as I said, that it's right-wing led by who?
Of course, clearly Israel has moved, the population has moved to the center, to the right over the past 15, 20 years. It's not something which has suddenly come up. But I think the problem with the premise, if I can be so bold as to say, Jeremy, with the premise of your question, is what does the average Israeli think? I think what these 4 elections have shown, and what there is no such thing as the average Israeli voter. It doesn't exist. The average Israeli voter is split. The country is split in every single way possible. Orthodox, non-Orthodox, or Haredi, non-Haredi. And what you're seeing actually in the past few years is, okay, the political views have moved to the right, but society as a whole has completely changed. And not actually incidentally only for the bad. I personally think that this incorporation or this hechsher that's been given to the Arab bloc, which are 20% of the Israeli society, is not necessarily a negative thing at all. I mean, of course, we don't agree with them, with many of the things that they are saying, especially their support of some of our biggest enemies. But a lot of people in Israel also don't support what Ben Gvir is saying by any means. And so I think that what we are seeing here is a change in the societal makeup. And the last year also has shown a greater rift on the negative side between the Haredim and the non-Haredim. I can see that within my own family, and we're, you know, from an Orthodox home, but my children, of course, they've become extremely anti-Haredim with all this inoculation and all of the problems revolving around these mass weddings and mass funerals, etc. So you're seeing a societal split as well. So you have the political side of it, but you have problems within society, and there is no such thing anymore as an average Israeli voter. And that's why I think it's almost impossible to say what people want, because there is no such thing as people. You can ask individuals what they want, but you'll find that we're split 59-61, whichever way you look around. What next? And so, of course, you can make up these governments of the type that Lahav has just said, and it makes sense. However, in politics, and Israel is no different from anywhere else, there is no way that you can divorce personal proclivities from ideological ones. There is no way that Gideon Saar will work with Netanyahu. I mean, with all respect and everything, the loathing between them is enormous. It's immense. It's not just we don't like each other. Saar loathes Netanyahu with a passion. I don't know how on earth you're going to get any Arab party and Ben-Gvir in the same box. I fail to see that in any way. But you could probably say that on the other side as well. My personal feeling, we probably find ourselves in the fifth election, but that's my own personal feeling. And even if we don't immediately, in other words, we can cobble some sort of rubbish together, it won't last. We'll have a problem with the Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank, so the Arabs will move away from Netanyahu. You'll have a problem between Merav Michaeli's party and Gideon Saar, which is a question of time and short time as well. Or Bennett, and so the problem therefore that will arise again. So even if they can cobble something together, I think it won't last for more than a few months.
Well, for what it's worth, your Australian audience overwhelmingly is of the view that there'll be a fifth election, 54%, and 30% believe that Netanyahu will form government, and 16% believe the non-Netanyahu government. So we'll do you want to, Lahav, for the record, we'll send you a fluffy kangaroo if you're right.
Like the thing that makes the most sense is a fifth election, because any coalition that could be formed doesn't make sense. Either Gideon Saar, who loathes Netanyahu and Netanyahu loathes him back, has to sit with Netanyahu. Or you have Ram, an Arab party, sitting with the religious Zionist extreme right. Or on the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or they call themselves the Change bloc, which honestly, it was a nifty bit of marketing that they did on the day of the election. And I thought to myself, had they not thought of that and campaigned on that for months earlier, maybe that would have been helpful. But in any case, the Change bloc is so heterogeneous, that in order to build a government coalition, they'd have to have Naftali Bennett, who is very right-wing, and Saar, who's quite right-wing, together with the Joint List, which is not only left-wing, but also, again, sides with some of Israel's enemies in conflicts, at least verbally. So none of these things make sense. And so to me, the only answer that makes sense is a fifth election, even though it's, the definition of insanity. That being said, I do think there's a lot of will to not have a fifth election. So there could be surprises.
I think that's the most important point. As I say, something's got to break. If there's not going to be a fifth, nobody wants a fifth election, except for maybe Benny Gantz, because he's looking ahead and sees that maybe in November, by the agreement they have, not that agreements have been kept to the full, but we'll leave that aside for a moment, but this one is actually ensconced in law. Except for Benny Gantz, nobody wants a fifth election. So there's going to be some abrogation of past statements. And nobody has a clue which abrogation is going to, who's going to do the abrogating. Will it be Bennett will say, okay, listen, I won't have the Ram inside of the government, but maybe I can sort of, turn a blind eye to the fact that they'll abstain on the vote or something like that. Or will it be even Smotrich or whatever his name, Ben-Gvir will say the same. The truth of the matter is, if something snaps, then the whole system will change. And what is actually interesting to look at right now is that for 8 days, Netanyahu hasn't opened his mouth. This is actually, I think, a Guinness Book of Records in and of itself. He hasn't said a word. Neither of any of his party, actually, they're working off, his instructions, of course. That's not very common. And so that seems to me, either they're reeling in shock, which I don't think that's his style, or something is cooking behind the scenes, which is more likely his style. And we're right now, as we're having this conversation, slap bang in the middle of all of this. So,
we certainly are. And so I think maybe that's a good opportunity, because I think it's worth talking a little bit more about Ra'am. And I mean, we have the fact that I think they unexpectedly sort of, hit the threshold. But the sort of aspect that I'm finding more interesting, and I'd be curious in your views on this, is there sort of like a greater symbolism or significance here to the role now that Ra'am is playing in these negotiations? I mean, you have an Islamist political party in the Jewish state that will be determining the election and will need to choose between supporting a right-wing government with, the likes of Ben Gvir involved, and I know religious Zionism have said they will not sit in a coalition with Ra'am, but query whether or not Bibi could sway them to do so, and then one needs to ask themselves what will be the price be that the country pays in return for that. But then likewise, Lapid is, by definition, will need to rely on the joint list and or possibly Ra'am. They're also in discussions. Both of these parties have, individuals that have said some, very troubling things, in addition to Ben Gvir and his friends. And so are there any, how do you see all of this? Are there any positive consequences in terms of, Israeli Arab greater participation in the democratic process in society that could flow from this? Lahav, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to this story, right? In the second and third elections, right? The joint list was enticed to recommend Benny Gantz as prime minister, and it really inspired a lot of the Israeli Arab public to think that their elected representatives are finally going to actually play an influential part in the political game. Because these parties, at least in recent decades, have never been willing to sit in any Israeli coalition. And so, and a lot of that has to do with the ideology. They don't support Israel as a Jewish state. They wouldn't want to be, quote unquote, complicit with what goes on in the West Bank. And in return, is the Jewish parties were not really courting them, so suddenly they were part of the game, they were being courted, and it was inspiring to a lot of the Israeli Arab public that they could have an influence and they could be a real part of politics. That being said, when Ra'am took it further than the rest of the joint list, Ra'am was willing to work with Netanyahu and negotiate with Netanyahu in order to have certain bills pass or not pass in exchange for more favorable policies for the public that they represent, which Ra'am skews very heavily to representing the Bedouin population in the Negev. They're a party that was formed by the Southern Islamic movement in Israel. The Northern Islamic movement boycotts the Knesset. And that shift broke up the joint list. So now the joint list is 3 parties and Ra'am is by itself. And the voting rate among Israeli Arabs is much lower because historically it's been seen that when the parties of the joint list, all 4 run together, the voting rate is very high among Israeli Arabs. So it, in a way, on the one hand, it gave them the feeling they were involved, and on the other hand, there are other things sort of lowering the vote. Now, that being said, when it comes to sort of the Jewish majority's willingness to actually work with these parties, they have not, just because they're willing to, they want to be able to work with, Likud and other politicians in order to get things for their constituents, doesn't mean that they've actually resolved the problems that the Jewish majority has had with them historically, which is to say that, Ra'am specifically, when these parties tend to be affiliated with groups, either political parties or civil society groups among the Palestinians. And Ra'am is affiliated with Hamas and more broadly in the Middle East with the Muslim Brotherhood. The leaders of Ra'am, including Mansour Abbas, who's currently the leader, past leaders who are still on sort of the steering committee of the party, they visit terrorists. They've participated in big public parties when terrorists were released from prison. And when it comes to the joint list, they have a party there called Balad, which is very extreme. And they even recently had a Knesset member go to prison because he smuggled cell phones and documents to Palestinian terrorists who were in prison. And then the quote unquote not extreme party, the communists in Hadash, which to begin with, they're communists, which is it's hard to describe that as not extreme, but at least when it comes to these sorts of things of sort of peaceful political aims, they've said things supporting Assad. So for Israelis, I don't think it's going to be so easy for Israelis, especially on the Israeli right, to just ignore those things, right? So on the one hand, there has been a call for years for these Israeli parties to say, focus on your domestic issues. you represent people in this country, you don't necessarily represent the Palestinians who, the Palestinian Authority represents them. But on the other hand, once they started doing that, people said, well, you can't do one and not the other. So Netanyahu tried to campaign to Israeli Arabs basically on the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords are extremely popular in the Arab population, polls show. But the joint list Knesset members voted against the Abraham Accords in the Knesset. So Netanyahu went around, in the campaign, he called himself Abu Yair, which is something that Ahmed Tibi, an Arab Knesset member, had called him to make fun of him. And then Netanyahu took that and said, okay, I'm Abu Yair. But it didn't really work for him. He got more Arab votes than he had in the past, but it was not enough to give him another Knesset seat. But he did find like an Arab educator willing to run on the Likud list. He promised to appoint that person as a minister, but he has promised many people they'd be ministers in the past. So I would take that with a grain of salt. But I think there's different sort of values and different things in tension when it comes to the Israeli Arab public and politics.
I agree with most of with most of the things. I'm not quite sure that it's absolutely true to say that the Arabs didn't want to join any. I mean, it is true, of course, that the Arabs didn't want to join any Israeli government, but I think more important than that is no Israeli government wanted the Arabs to join them. And I think that that's more important than, because of course the Jewish majority they call the shots. And if you look at one side and say we don't want them, that's more important than the other side saying we don't want to join. And I think what we're seeing now is a change in that. And I agree that that change started in the last elections, not in these ones. In the last elections, when they recommended Benny for prime minister, and that really was a first. They've never recommended a Zionist or a centrist Zionist as well to be a prime minister. And I think that this inching together here between even the right wing in Israel, you see some of the commentators. I mean, I'm not a great fan, to be honest with you. I'm not a great fan of Caroline Glick's writings, to be honest with you. But when she talks about possibility of moving towards Ram because that will set up a government. I mean, this is the sort of side of language 5 years ago, I think I'd have to take some sort of, psychiatric test that she said that. And not only her, but many in the camp, in that camp as well, are saying, let's look at this possibility is already some sort of form of acceptance. And so I think that it's not a bad thing. We're talking 18 to 20% of Israeli society. We may not agree, we don't agree with them, but they're a fifth of the country. And to have a closer knit, even under intense disagreement, is something which is not necessarily negative in the more societal way, perhaps in the less election way. Now, I think what Bibi did succeed, and here I'm not sure that I agree. It's true that he didn't succeed in getting enough of the Arab voters to vote for him in order to give him another mandate. At one stage, they were saying that there would be enough votes in the Arab camp that he would have 2 mandates from the Arab camp. But I think what you're seeing here is that he did manage, and this was actually, I must say, a brilliant move on his part, to this talking to Ram and talking to and trying to bring them in caused an enormous amount, a huge drop, was one of the causes of a huge drop in the Arab turnout at the elections. And that for him, of course, was perfect because, none of them would actually vote for him, or very few of them would actually vote for him in the first place. So, I used to work with, which actually gives away a little bit of where I'm coming from. I used to work with Shimon Peres as the policy advisor. I was a foreign ministry person, but he was the prime minister. And they said, what is the biggest difference between Peres and Netanyahu? And the biggest difference, was said at the time, was that Peres was a great statesman. He had world visions and views, and he could have been the United Nations Secretary General. But it came to petty politics in Israel, he didn't have a clue. He had no clue whatsoever. He was never voted in. He never became prime minister, etc. Netanyahu is in many ways the exact opposite. I'm not quite sure I know what his world vision is. I don't know what his vision is on the Middle East. I don't know what his vision is on 2 states, 1 state. It seems to be quite mobile. But on the other hand, as far as manipulating or working, manipulating is negative, as far as working within the system and working around the system, I think there's nobody better than him. in Israel, and here as well. Had he not brought down the amount of Arab voters turning out in the last election, he would have lost by quite a lot. In other words, had the Arabs come at the same level to vote as they had beforehand, then he would have been much less than the 59 that his sort of bloc had. So I think in that respect, you have to sort of, lift your cap. But the bottom line is that we are where we are. And so I don't think it's all negative. I think quite a lot of things that are going on in society, etc., are quite positive as a matter of fact. But of course, the political deadlock leaves us with a political deadlock. No budget. The world around us not getting any better. The Hamas, Syria, Yemen, etc. The Middle East is still the quagmire it was. Lebanon, and there's no decision making of any serious thought being given, which is the biggest, most frightening thing of all. Iran, of course.
So that's interesting, and I want to come back afterwards to. I thought it was interesting, Mark, your observations around the sort of difference responsibility of the Jewish majority, and because I want to touch on that when we talk afterwards about Otzma and religious Zionism. But before we do that, we're going to do a little experiment here. We'll do a live question from the audience. We have Josh Feldman, who's a young rising star in the Jewish community, and he's asked a question. Josh, we will see if we can get you to answer this live now. If you can turn on your camera, hopefully we'll see you. Okay, well, maybe. Oh, yep, here we go. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, Josh, over to you.
Hi, I'm Mark Lahav. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat to us. Question that I have is, given Bibi's populist tactics, and Mark, I think what you referred to as Bibiism, let's say that possibly, Bibi is ousted as PM after, in the next few weeks, or even any time in the near future, if there's a fifth election, if he ends up resigning. What do you think will happen to, I guess, what some people would even call a cult of this following that seems to view the only way that we can, steer Israel in the right direction as Bibiism, and no other way will, keep Israel safe? So what do you think will happen to that worldview if Bibi is to lose his position?
All right, I'll go first then. So, look, I think the Bibism is very narrowly defined in terms of that they'll follow Netanyahu like Bayeshu Bamayim, like, through anything, that they are so loyal to Netanyahu. But ideologically, like, as far as like the policies that they want to promote, like Netanyahu and Bennett, like there's almost no difference between them. Maybe Bennett's a little bit more right-wing on say settlement issues and things like that, but I don't think that there's a lot of space for movement there right now anyway, which if people want to know about that, I can answer questions about that. But and Bennett has his own sort of populist leanings. So it kind of depends who ends up being the leader of the right? Like if there's a different government and it's led by a different right-wing person, if it's Bennett, he's not going to be the leader of Bibism, but he might be, I think, to some extent tempted to lean into it in some ways, in others not. If it's Sar is like the anti-populist. He forgive me for saying this, but he has like the charisma of a tree stump, and he's very smart and very effective, but I don't see him leading any kind of populist movement ever. I think, look, when Trump was voted out, and I don't think Netanyahu is just like Trump, but they do have some things in common. When Trump was voted out, people said he's going to sort of play a huge role from the outside as this sort of opposition from the outside, making all sorts of statements that are very disruptive. It's only been a little over 2 months, but so far I think that's not the case. Like, yes, he goes on Fox News sometimes, and there are still people who are extremely pro-Trump. and the Republican Party is still pretty populist. That being said, so far, it doesn't look like Trump himself is the big player. So I feel like Netanyahu is not someone who's going to ride off in the sunset when he loses and he's just going to be quiet and whatever. If somehow Netanyahu is no longer in politics, he will try to make his voice heard, but I think that his movement, so to speak, will be weakened by the fact that he's not there anymore. Now, there's another option, which you didn't mention in your question, but that somebody else becomes prime minister and Netanyahu stays as opposition leader. And I think that Netanyahu would do that, because I think Netanyahu would think that he has a chance, that the government won't be stable and he will have a better chance of winning the next time if somebody else fails. And in that case, the Bibism doesn't have to die. It can just be an opposition movement. And it is de facto an opposition movement anyway, because even though they're supporting the serving prime minister, it's very much a movement based on grievances against the establishment. And, what better place to do that than from the opposition?
Interesting. Of course, he'd be facing trial while opposition leader, which would make things interesting.
Yes. Less interesting than facing trial while prime minister, though. I would say.
True.
I personally don't subscribe to the possibility that Bibi will become head of the opposition. I think after 14 or 15 years as prime minister, and seeing himself as the great leader of whether he sees himself or whether others see him, I can't see him suddenly fading into the opposition and being somehow irrelevant, and he'll build up something else. They're talking here of him running for the presidency. I don't think that's feasible either, but nonetheless, there are a few points in Josh's question which are worth looking at. Number one is that it's not just, and here I agree with Lahav, it's not just that Bibi is incredibly popular within the Likud party, but generally speaking, if you look since the founding of the state in 1948, the DNA of the Likud is that we don't change our leaders. We had Begin for 35 years, we had Shamir for about 15 years. I think we've only had about 5 leaders in the Likud, whereas the Labour Party, which was its major opposition, we had 5 leaders a week, and they had more leaders than we've had more than we've had hot dinners. So the bottom line of all of that is that it's not just the sort of, we look at the leader as being the leader, it's just not part of the political process that goes inside of the Likud party. Will support them till the end. But what is happening now, and this is an important point, is that in the last elections, despite having this open goal, despite the vaccinations, despite the Abraham Accords, despite the lack of, the split in the Arab vote, and he still lost. And it's worth looking very closely, deeper down, a sort of forensic at how people voted. The Likud lost 6 seats. It lost 300,000 or so voters. That's 25% of its voting from the elections beforehand, which is a huge amount. Number one. Number two is, more importantly, and not less importantly, if you look at the major Likud strongholds throughout the country, in the Negev or elsewhere, in every single one of them, the vote for the Likud went down. In every single one. There isn't one in which it went up. I think there was in Modi'in Illit or something like that. But serious, not one serious place where it went up. And so there is clearly a growing dissatisfaction, whether it's personal and they voted for some of the other right-wing candidates, or whether they didn't vote at all, or whether they voted even for Gantz, or for, which probably in some cases happened. This, it's not cult of the individuals. We have to be very careful of using wrong wordings here, because that's going overboard. But this sort of reverence for the leader is certainly to a certain extent dissipating. And I think that is probably why Bibi very strongly does not want a 5th election. I think it'll continue, that this path will continue, and he sees that. He's got great political acumen. And so for that reason, I think that the question of this Bibism or will dissipate. I do think also that the vast majority of the members of the right don't want the Bibism, even those within the Likud party. I mean, in the Likud party, there are some very, very wonderful politicians. I mean, we can look at Tzachi Hanegbi. He's not a screaming and shouting, or even Nir Barkat or others. They're not one of these, Miri Regev types who come out on the screen, waving flags and this awful populism, which most people don't feel good about. Or Mickey Zohar comes out. The three most important things in my life are power, strength, and money. I mean, this is really awful, or something to that effect. But there are people that subscribe to it, most don't, and I think that this populism is moving downwards, and so basically all options are open. I don't see an end to Bibism, but I see a lessening of its strength, and I think eventually, even if we had a fifth election, or even maybe a sixth one, and I agree with those who think there may be one, eventually the direction is going in one way only. And that is that it seems to me that as a politician or as a leader, Bibi Netanyahu's time is up. I know that's a strong statement to make. It's a big statement to make, and he's not going to go up without a fight. I certainly agree that Gideon Sa'ar has the political dynamics of a tree stump. I agree with that entirely. Mind you, Rabin did as well. He wasn't a great charismatic leader. Begin was, and others were, but certainly not Gideon Sa'ar, who, to a lot of people, the minute he opens his mouth, it's sort of soporific, and you sort of begin to nod off the minute he starts talking. But I don't think that's the problem that Bibi is facing right now. I think it's a much wider one inside of society, I think, to be honest with you, my feeling is that the end is in sight. We'll go through a few more ulcers, maybe a government completely non-functional, maybe squeezing strange bedfellows into the same bed, which will be awful. It won't work. It won't last. But the bottom line of all of this is that the direction in all four of these elections is the same direction.
Well, I want to move on to talk a little about religious Zionism. But Mark, let me just say, it's great to hear you in retirement.
Yeah, well, being an ambassador gives you constraints, to be honest with you. I can say, and if I wouldn't still have these 39 years of being in the foreign ministry behind me, I'd probably be much more open.
I think we can read between the lines. So I want to talk about religious Zionism, and to be completely honest, I wince a little bit when I call that party by the name that it's given itself, because I mean, in effect, as Lahav mentioned, at least part of it, certainly Ben Gvir and Otzma are, effectively the ideological descendants of Meir Kahane. And when I speak to, friends, family in Israel, in the religious Zionist camp, not the religious Zionist party, they all say, I mean, literally all of them almost say, I don't know anyone who identifies as religious Zionist that is voting for that party. Now, that may be a bit extreme, but I have read quite a bit about, sort of the primary supporters of, certainly of Otzma, not being your traditional religious Zionists. So, Lahav, can you tell us a little bit about, who is voting for Otzma, who is voting for the religious Zionism party? And, we're talking about over 150,000 Israelis that voted for a party with the knowledge that someone like Ben Gvir, who has a picture of Baruch Goldstein up in his house, could be given a minute. He took it down, well, had to, until recently, a picture of Baruch Goldstein, and, could be a minister in a government, or certainly it's his ticket into the Knesset. How do we understand all of this?
Look, there's religious Zionism as a group in society, of which I am a member myself, is in a way like a false construct, and has been for some time. For a long time, it was pretty fair to say that they were well represented by what was known as the National Religious Party, which existed for like the first 6 decades of Israel's since Israel's establishment, and for several decades before that in the Mizrahi movement, which I know exists in Australia as well. But in more recent years, I think the roots of it are post 1967, but especially in more recent years, there's a sort of more using a more radical branch of it that is that puts the land of Israel before the state of Israel ideologically. Now, it doesn't mean that they're all lawbreakers or anything like that, because I mean, Bezalel Smotrich, he maybe got a little carried away in some protests in the 2005 disengagement, but overall, I think he is someone who stands for the rule of law. Whereas Ben Gvir, the head of the Otzma party, the Kahanist party, does not. I mean, he simply does not. But overall, I think that these divisions really began to be laid bare after the 2005 Gaza disengagement, where almost the entire religious Zionist population opposed the disengagement, and then there was a reckoning. You know, these people, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets all over the country, protested, you know, voted for the people who opposed the disengagement. They did all they could in the quote unquote right way and legal way, and the leadership told them to keep it legal. And overwhelmingly, that's what they did, the vast majority. And then it didn't work. And then there was this very, very big reckoning. Now, to a large part of religious Zionism, the response was, we are not getting our messages across about the importance of the land of Israel and its centrality, not only to us religiously, but also in politics and how Israel defends itself, et cetera. We're not getting it across well, and we need to be more involved in broader society, which in a way is a return to religious Zionism's roots. And then a smaller part became sort of more radicalized and anti-establishment. And the Religious Zionist Party, I think, where it stands now is an outgrowth of that more radicalized minority, but large minority among religious Zionists in Israel. And your friends are probably more moderates, but I have to say that I do know people who are in that area. I do know people who attended yeshivas where almost everyone who goes to that yeshiva voted, you know, and it's not necessarily because they like Ben Gvir. I can't say that I personally know people who voted for that party because of Ben Gvir, but I do know people who really support Bezalel Smotrich, the head of the bloc, you know, who kind of puts the land of Israel before all else. That is his priority. Although he was transportation minister for a few months and did some good things there as well that were not, you know, in pre-67 Israel. You know, that's the, I think it's like a sociological sort of phenomenon that's now expressed in the politics, and the fact that Smotrich and Bennett kept running together represented this sort of desire or even like nostalgia among religious Zionists to say that we are all one group, when really they've diverged a long time ago.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say that I'm the oldest one here by far. And I also remember coming from an Orthodox family myself many years ago. I remember clearly that the religious Zionist, the Mizrahi movement of the Mafdal party was actually left-wing. And it was actually left-wing. We had the Melamed. Well, Borg, I wouldn't classify him as left-wing, but he was certainly centrist or Hammer. But that was already, but even before then, you had people who were very, very much aligned with the Labour Party. So I think what's happened is that the religious Zionists themselves have lurched to the right, rather than and then of course the things begin to split up, and that's exactly what's happened. I personally find Ben Gvir to be anathema, and now you say I can say what I like. I think it's terrible that a Jewish state has somebody of his ilk inside the Knesset, and this is my personal opinion, and I can say what I feel. I certainly don't agree with a lot of the Arab things and the members of parliament and what they've done, but I'm Jewish, and I think that our history has shown that we cannot have people who, or even Smotrich, as some of the statements he's made, I refuse to have my wife giving birth to an Arab doctor. I mean, these are racist statements of the worst order, and I think that they're awful. And it's a shame that people have gone that far in lurching to the right. And I also think that Smotrich didn't particularly want Ben Gvir in the party, but Netanyahu pushed them in for actually good political reasons, as far as he's concerned, because neither of them might have gone under the threshold. I think the problem is today, therefore, and here I agree with Lahav, is that the religious Zionist movement is completely, is not one, it's not a monolithic bloc by any means, not even in the West Bank or in Judea and Samaria is it a monolithic bloc. And looking at the voting patterns there, you see it clearly. So that's really where we stand. I think that the issue of the religious Zionists is one part of the whole, of the wider picture, and that things are mobile there as well. And I'm a little bit nonplussed at some of the at the situation, of course, that we find ourselves in with them, when the movement from, of course, education, Jewish values has suddenly given complete way. All of those are like third or fourth on the list, and the most important thing is the land of Israel. Then something has happened within that type of movement as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, and
I just want to add, because there's something in the religious Zionist bloc that we didn't address, which is that there's the Noam party, which
you say that, you're good point.
Yeah, which the Noam party is comes from one of these sort of radical religious Zionist yeshivas, and their entire platform is for the quote unquote normal family, which it's an anti-gay platform, but it's also like a traditional family platform in a way that could be fairly misogynistic. And that also is something that I don't think has such a broad appeal in religious Zionism. I mean, I can't say that the religious Zionist establishment is so gay friendly, because it's not, but the sort of picking that as its core issue is something, there was no way that they would have passed the threshold on their own, so much so that they quit in the third election, like 2 days before the actual election, because they realized they were just taking votes away from other right-wing parties. But unfortunately, we now have someone in the Knesset for whom homophobia is a priority. And that actually applies in the Arab parties as well, because one of the reasons that Ra'am broke off from the joint list had to do with a vote on gay issues, and the Islamist party is also not a friend of LGBT people, but we're talking about religious Zionists now.
And in fairness, Lahav, you know, Smotrich has come out with some pretty outrageous, you know, comments.
Yes,
on
although I will say
well.
Before he was a Knesset member and he apologized for it. I can't imagine that he's going to be supporting gay marriage anytime soon, but at least, you know, like I feel like if he apologized, then we don't need to like dredge it up.
Worth noting, one of the most senior ministers of the Likud party is a open homosexual, which actually
Justice Minister, yeah.
The Minister of Justice, well, he's not.
Police.
He was the Justice Minister. Yeah.
Was Minister of Justice. Yeah. And so again, and we talked about strange bedfellows. Here you have a party which is sole platform of Noam is anti-gay, supporting wildly a party, being Netanyahu's party, which has got an openly gay senior minister. So again, this is the type of mess we're in. I think it's more exemplary, an example rather than anything else.
I want to just, you know, and we're hitting the end of the time now, but I just want to finish off with a final question. I apologize to the audience, we haven't got to all the questions, but I think this captures some of the questions that are coming through. You know, I think there's certainly consensus, and Mark, you've shared your view, Lahav, it's pretty clear, and you know, the issue of Otzma is one of the rare issues where the Australian Jewish community, and we in the Zionist Federation, we don't generally comment on Israeli politics, but that's where we felt that it was certainly necessary to make very clear our you know, concern, our outrage really at the active facilitation of Ben Gvir and the like being, you know, effectively facilitating their way into the Knesset. But at the same time, you know, we do have to look at these things, I think, objectively and consistently. And, you know, Mark, you made a comment a minute ago where you said Bibi had good political reasons, and I agree with you, for facilitating Otzma's inclusion in religious Zionism, because it would have had a material effect. And I guess the thing, and maybe it's just in the diaspora, maybe I'm slightly less cynical here, that I struggle with is at what point do we collectively call it, maybe not the average Israeli, but let's say the Jewish collective, do we draw that line in the sand and we say political expediency is understandable? It happens in every Western democratic system. It happens in Australia. But we have to have our red lines. And as the Jewish people, if we want to be the Jewish state, the fulfillment of the Zionist vision, at what point do we say, no, this is where that ends? And is it at Ben Gvir, or is it at relying on the joint lists and some of those very extreme elements, to form a coalition? At what point do we turn around collectively and say, you know what, we don't need any of these people. We can go back to the days of, we had governments of national unity and bring everyone together. And maybe if we didn't have that division of personality that Lahav was talking about earlier, it would be possible. But isn't that really what the next election, if there is one, should result in, is a government of national unity with the extremes outside of government?
Can I, you go first?
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Okay. So I think what you're saying, Jeremy, brings me full circle back to what I'm very cynical on this type of issue, but full circle to what I said at the very beginning, which was, why did we have these elections in the first place? And the reason that we had these elections in the first place is because, let's be honest, ideology has no place in the political system that we have, or very small place in the political. Of course, there's I'm at least as reviled as you are, probably, obviously some people aren't, that we have Ben Gvir in the Knesset, and he was pushed into it by the Prime Minister. But the reason that he did it was in order to keep his political, try and keep him at the leadership, at the helm of Israeli politics, which may have succeeded or may not have succeeded. But that's the whole reason we had an election in the first place, was to find a way to keep him at the helm in the first place. So I'm very cynical. I don't believe that there is an ideological block that can't be overcome. And Ben Gvir pushing him in is part of it, or Noam, which in many respects is just as bad, or is part and parcel of the whole thing. The same is true of trying to come to grips with the Ram party, which was anathema. And you can look at the statements made by the Likud themselves, that they are the worst of the four Arab parties, not one of the four Arab, but the worst of the four Arab parties. In the last election was the Ram, even worse than Balad. And yet you can squeeze them in here somehow. So ideology has been thrown to the wind. It doesn't exist. It's only political machinations here that is important. That's the cynicism that I think we all find ourselves in. But I think it's also a realism, to be honest with you. And that's the way unfortunately, that's the way the political system works. So, of course, you've been watching Ben Gvir in the last few weeks. He's been saying more moderate statements, which I believe as much as none at all, not one whatsoever. But he has to say that in order to try and square the circle. So I don't believe that ideology has got any role to play at all. And I think you can, or very little role, and you can play around with it and fit it into anything you want, just in order to keep power or stay in power or get back power or whatever you like. I'm very cynical on that one.
Lahav, any final observations, and then we'll wrap up.
There was a time when Netanyahu liked to form a coalition and have the party that's more, at least one party that is more right-wing than Likud, be outside the coalition, so that Likud could be the center-right party, not just the right. Those days have passed. By the way, the last time that happened, no, not last time that happened, but in 2009 to 2013, the more right-wing party that he left out was a party that had a Knesset member from the same party as Ben Gvir, Michael Ben-Ari, who has since been disqualified from running by the Supreme Court for racism, just like Meir Kahane, their rabbi, was disqualified. And of course, first of all, there's a substantial difference between Ben-Ari being in the Knesset and Ben Gvir being in the Knesset, which is that Ben-Ari did not have any kind of encouragement or help from Netanyahu, and he was in the opposition for almost 4 years. Ben Gvir, on the other hand, is really only in the Knesset because Netanyahu made this shidduch between Otzma and religious Zionism. And there's talk that he will be in the coalition. And you hear the way Netanyahu talks, that he says, I want a government, yamin al maleh, fully right-wing, he says. So it looks like he's okay with having Ben-Gvir in there. And I agree with you that this is, he sort of crossed an ideological red line. Back in the days when Meir Kahane was in the Knesset, all of the Knesset members would walk out on him. Yitzhak Shamir would not stay in the room to listen to Meir Kahane talk. So things have changed a lot since then. And I think part of it is that Netanyahu is waging a battle of personal survival. And to some extent is taking the whole country hostage with him in that battle. Now, I say to some extent because, look, he has huge support. And he won that support fair and square, both internally in his party and in the election. But as Mark had said earlier, there was no good reason for us to go to a fourth election. And if we go to a fifth, it will probably be because of sort of personal survival considerations by Netanyahu and possibly Gantz. So, when Netanyahu looks at, I could have a coalition that might vote to change the laws that could help me in my trial, or I have a coalition that will help me, even just a coalition that keeps him prime minister. Netanyahu believes that being prime minister will bring a more favorable result in his trial. He's putting that ahead of what were once ideological concerns. He was once what Avigdor Lieberman called the Feinschmeckers of Likud. And now he doesn't care about those things anymore.
Well, Lahav and Mark, thank you very much for joining.
Sure,
Mark, by all means.
Final observation, and that is the following. Conspiracy theorists would say that we're running now to try and get 61 seats in the Knesset. Any type, any party, and we're looking for somebody to blame and looking for somebody to put the problems on, etc. And I noticed recently, or I thought recently, that the international code for Australia is 61, and I'm looking for somebody to blame. I think finally we have found the right approach, and that we can put all the blame for this terrible situation that we're in on all of you guys. So thank you very much for all that you've done for us.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I'll hand over to Bren just to wrap things up. Thank you. Bren, you're on mute. You're on mute, Bren. Well, Bren is on mute, but he can't hear us. So,
oh, I'm so sorry. Here we go.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy. I was just launched into the poll results, but first of all, I thank Lahav and Mark, and of course yourself, Jeremy. That was a really, really interesting conversation. So, so thanks. And the problem is you've made us all even more pessimistic about the likelihood that a government will form. The numbers of people who believe that Netanyahu will form a government have dropped. And the number of people who thought that or think that a fifth election will be the outcome has unfortunately risen as a result of your conversation. So that is a shame. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. Tonight's conversation will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow morning. If you go to zfa.com.au/YouTube, you will see it there, and you will be able to not only visit tonight's conversation, but every single lockdown learning conversation from last year and all the other great content we post as well. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and you won't miss another thing. Finally, don't forget to join us on April 18 as we speak with Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky. Registration is open at zfa.com.au/conversations. Until then, Chag Sameach to you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.